They were farmers. They were old-time farmers. Worst experience of my life. These two babies, and they weighed 2.5 pounds. They put them in shoe boxes behind the stove to keep them warm. And I spelled it O-L-N-Y, and I remember writing it. I was born May 30, 1942, right at the start of World War II. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, where they hold the 500-mile race. And I lived in Speedway, right near the 500-mile race. At least that's where I came home to. They didn't have it that year because of the war. I was actually born on that day, on race day. And, you know, it was always a holiday until about 20 years ago when they decided it should be a Monday holiday. It really should still be on May 30 because that's my birthday and I should have it off. That's what I believe. I lived the first several years, 4 years of my life in Indianapolis, in and around Indianapolis. My father, we moved around a lot. My father did not have an education, did not have a secure job. We were poor. And when I was 5 or 6, we moved to a farm with my grandparents, and we lived there about 3.5 years. And they were farmers. They were old-time farmers. We had 80 acres. 40 of it was alfalfa and wheat, and the other 40 were uncultivated. And we had chickens and rabbits and cows and pigs. Chickens, rabbits, cows, and pigs, right. And we bartered food we grew all of our own food. We had a garden. Just take a salt shaker and go out and eat the tomatoes. There's nothing like Indiana tomatoes in the late summer. There still is nothing like Indiana tomatoes in the late summer, but it's a hard life. My grandfather and my dad got up at 3:30, milked the cows, fed the chickens and the hogs and all that sort of thing, and then drove into Indianapolis, which was about 40 miles away, to work in what was called a foundry, and I don't think we even have those anymore. But they made core parts to stoves. There was the little thing where the flame comes out. They put sand in molds and slid those molds into a very, very hot furnace that they stood next to all day. And then when they took them out, when they were baked, they poked holes, made sure the holes were open, and then came home. I think they got home around 4 o'clock, and then they fed the cows and milked the cows and fed the chickens and did all of that again. And we didn't have running water. We did have electricity. We didn't have running water, but they went to bed at, with dark. I mean, sort of, not exactly, but pretty close, because they just lived a really, really hard life. My mother always said later, if she'd known how hard she worked, she wouldn't have been able to do it. And my grandmother and my mother canned. We canned, and everything we ate, we came out of the garden. They planted the garden in the spring, and they canned beans, and then they made jelly, and it was a very I always tell everybody my clothes came from feed sacks, because the sacks that we bought feed for the animals in were fabric, and they were bright colored, and I always got to go to the feed store and pick it out because that was going to be my next dress. And little girls didn't wear pants, so there were always dresses, and my mother and my grandmother made the dresses. My grandmother churned butter every day. I would walk by and put my finger in the butter churn and have a bite of very, very, very fresh butter. They made bread. They made everything. I can remember harvest time when the men from all the surrounding farms came to harvest the wheat and the alfalfa, and the men sitting around the table and the women standing behind them and serving them, because it was feeding these people who were starving because they'd been working. And then they moved to another farm and they all helped each other like that. It was not a cooperative exactly, but sort of. It was sort of the beginning of that whole idea that you helped your neighbor. My mother's name is Minnie, like Minnie Mouse, and my father's name was Wally. And they have been, my mother, their birthdays are both in January. This is January. My mother would have been 100 on January 21, and my father would have been 103 3 days ago on January 27. Yeah. And my dad died of heart trouble. My mother died of Alzheimer's. My mother was, by the way, an identical twin. And I always tell the story that when they were born in 1916, they weighed 2.5 pounds apiece. Now, mind you, there was no neonatal, and there was no knowing that she was going to have twins. There were no sonograms. So it was the dead of winter. There was snow was piled up everywhere. And my grandmother had these two babies, and they weighed 2.5 pounds. They put them in shoe boxes behind the stove to keep them warm. And they were identical twins to the day they died, literally, when they were still well. They both died of Alzheimer's. They both had the 4 same diseases. They both had migraine headaches. They both had diverticulosis. They both died of Alzheimer's. They had something else. And my own mother, and I could not tell them apart on the phone until they'd talked for maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Just kind of one of those things. I was an only child for 8 wonderful long years. That's what I tell my brother and sister, because I was explaining to somebody that when you were born in 1942, there weren't any more babies because the war intervened. And so the generation, when you talk about the baby boomers, they started when the war ended and the men came home, and 9 months later there were lots and lots of babies. Those are baby boomers. I'm a pre-baby boomer. And they so my sister was born in 1949, and my brother was born in 1952. So they're 8 and 10 years younger than I am, 7.5 and 10 years younger than I am. And my brother John today helps me with my company. He has an Amazon business. He quit a very long-term job. At the same time, I quit a very long-term job. And after I wrote the book, and I was going to be publishing it on my own, I called him and said, what am I going to do? And he lived in Seattle most of his life, and he had just moved literally 2 months before that to the Pismo Beach area of California. And so it's been lovely because I get to go up to Pismo Beach every 6 or 8 weeks on business, because he is business. And he found a web guy for me, actually. And so John does all of my shipping for me. And really has been a fabulous help. It's been really good. My sister's name's Peggy, and she lives in Las Vegas, outside of Las Vegas. And the interesting thing is, my name is really Margaret, and her name is Peggy, which is really a nickname for Margaret. And I have no idea what my parents were thinking, but my mother's twin is my Aunt Margaret. I was named after her. And guess what? She's an English teacher. She was an English teacher. She taught 28 years in the same classroom in a little school in Indiana, in Indianapolis. And then later got her master's in library science and was a librarian. And so I'm named after her. And they called her Margaret, so Margie was the obvious thing, I guess. But so we've got Margie and Peggy. Kind of weird, I know. We're from Indiana, what can I tell you? Well, I was little on the farm, but my job was to collect the chicken eggs, to collect the eggs in the chicken coop. And let me tell you that I can still remember opening that door, have it be hot. Oh, geez, it was hot and humid. Midwest, guys. Think of Indiana in the Midwest in the middle of August. And my job was to go in there and get the eggs. And first of all, when you opened the door, there was the smell. And then there was the chickens flapping around and feathers flying everywhere. And really, I mean, on all seriousness, I'm afraid of animals. I'm not an animal person, because my grandfather would stick me in the pig pen, and he thought that was just great fun for me to be in there. I was little. I was teeny. And he put me in there with those pigs that weigh hundreds of pounds. And he thought that was just really funny. And I'm leery, particularly big dogs. Anything big, it's not cute as far as I'm concerned. It's, let me out of here. Anyway. So I'm not an animal person. I think you're one or the other when you grow up on a farm. And then they thought it was cute that if I could milk the cow, and to milk a cow, whether you know this or not, you have to sit down underneath it when you're only 4 feet tall. And it was just, it was not the best experience. Then there were the pigs, when we slaughtered the pigs and they were hanging upside down. For those of you who've never been on a farm, it's not fun. Well, we grew everything we ate. So the nights when we were having chicken, my mom would go out in the yard and grab a chicken, which just kind of wandered around part of the time. They weren't always in the coop. And and chop its head off and let it run around until all the blood had drained out of it. And then we plucked the chicken. I got to do that too, pluck the chicken. And yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, I think a lot of people don't relate to it. One time when I was teaching spelling, I was teaching the word paraffin, and most of the people in my class, most of the students, didn't know what paraffin was. So, you know, we got to decide how many R's and how many F's it has, but also, and so, but to me, paraffin was on the back of the stove at all times. And when I said to the students, so why do you think we put the paraffin across the jelly and stuff? They had no idea. I said, because it didn't have preservatives in it, and it's what preserved it. And then we had a cold storage cellar where it was underground, and you walked down about 5 stairs. It had a door that kind of opened up like that, and you walked down, and then that's where we kept all the stuff that they canned, because we didn't have, you know, I mean, we had electricity, but you didn't put all that, there's no place to put it, so it was all in the cold storage. So in the winter, you'd go out, if you wanted green beans, you would go out and go down into the cold cellar after you cleared the snow away and pick out the green beans that you're going to have for dinner. And by the way, there was also no waste on the farm. You didn't throw anything away. If you had a ham, you had ham the first night, and then you had some sliced ham for breakfast, and then you had eventually ham sandwiches, and ultimately you had ham and beans, because the ham bone then went in with the beans. And if you didn't eat it all that night, you were going to get it the next day. You might as well just eat it, because one of the things that I particularly remember is that when they fried chicken, which by the way, it was the best fried chicken on the planet, but they fried it in lard. That's why it was good. And then the next day you had fried chicken for lunch, and then the next day you had fried chicken for lunch. You were going to eat every single piece of that chicken, which by the way was very fresh also, because they'd cut off its head so that we could eat it. Yeah. Anyway, that's life on the farm. I was there until I was about 8, and then we moved into Indianapolis because farming is very tough, and a little bitty, you know, personal farm I don't think made a lot of money. And so we moved into Indianapolis, and we moved into a trailer park. I always say we were white trailer trash. We lived in a 27-foot trailer, 4 of us. My sister had been born by then, a 27-foot trailer. My sister had a little bed that flipped out over the foot of my parents' bed. My parents' bed had 3 sides that were up against a wall, and I slept on the couch. And this last summer, my cousin and I, she lived in the same trailer park for a time. We went back to that trailer park, and I have to say, it was sobering. We saw 2 little girls who probably were about our age, holding hands, walking down, but abandoned trailers and dirty and old, and that's the way I remember it, actually. But school was right next door. I walked right next door to go to school. And then we had the opportunity. We moved into a little house. It didn't have running water either. Nothing had running water. And my dad was that foundry was going to close, and that was a part of, you know, it was modernizing. I have no idea what that meant exactly, but he was not going to have a job, and he had quit school in the 6th grade to go to work to help support the family. And he was not going to have a job, and I always told this story. My mother was 9 months pregnant. My brother was due, and my mother had an aunt who lived in California, and her husband had a tool company. And they called on Friday night, and he was having some big, huge delivery, and he needed somebody, and they knew that my dad was out of work, or was going to be out of work. And so that was on Friday. They needed to know by Sunday, and whether we would come to California, and by the way, for $50 a week. And they made that decision. My mother had my brother on Tuesday, and my father left the following Saturday to come out here to work, and he worked for 2 months out here and then came back to get us. And my mother sold the house, and there were 3 kids, and I have all of their letters that they wrote back and forth, and have read many of them. One of them says, from my mother, "Margie's being bad." I thought, how could I be bad? I was 9 years old, for heaven's sakes, and I was not bad. But Margie's being bad, I'm not buying her an Easter dress. And I thought, yeah, come on, Mom. And he actually wrote back and said, I think she deserves an Easter dress. So anyway, so we came to California in 1952, and We settled in East Los Angeles when in a big housing development kind of thing. And in 1953, following the American dream, they bought a house. They bought a house in Santa Fe Springs for $9,900. 3 bedrooms, one bath about the size of a postage stamp. And that's where I sold that house when my mother died of Alzheimer's, and we sold it in 1999. So she lived there 46 years, and they never added on. It was just a little postage stamp house. My grandparents came and spent five months in the winter, and 7 of us in 900 square feet. But the year my dad, the year before he retired, and he only lived 6 months after retirement, he made $30,000, and that was just a fortune, a fortune. He made $30,000. I have his W-2 from 1946, where he made $4,600 in 1946. So. Oh no, I didn't have brothers and sisters then. I was the only child then. Those were the good old days. No, no, I didn't play. I was afraid of the animals because of my grandfather mainly, but that's when I started reading because even though I was little, that was sort of my escape from all this, because there was very often and it's what they said is you need to go away from here because it was because it was dangerous. I mean, there's a lot of really dangerous things on the farm. So if they were going to be in the creamery with these big, huge urns of milk and everything, it was, you need to go play. You need to go play. Well, there was nobody to go play with. We were miles down the road from somebody. Closest neighbor was about a half a mile away. And I read, that's when I started reading, and I had a linoleum floor that was like a Monopoly board, sort of. I don't think it was really Monopoly. But it had letters and it had words, and I really believe that that's really where I started really loving words. And then my Aunt Margaret, with whom, again, I don't think my parents had a lot of friends. What we had is family, and we spent Saturday with my dad's family and Sunday with my mom's family to the day we came to California, because that's just what you did. My dad had 3 sisters, and I have 3 cousins on that side. And my mom had 2 sisters, and I have 3 cousins on that side. And so there are 9 of us in my generation. I always say there are 9 of us in my generation, and 8 of them were married before they were 20, and either 4 or 5 of them had children before they were 20. And when I graduated from college, my dear sister said to me, "You are going to be an old maid school teacher. You do not even have a boyfriend." And I was 21 by 6 days at that point, and I was going to be an old maid school teacher, clearly because I didn't have a boyfriend. And I didn't get married until I was 24, so I was old. I mean, that's what was really, really old in that. And I really do believe that it changed my life. My life would have been totally different had we stayed, because I would have gotten married, no doubt. I mean, we were so poor, we were really, really not. I mean, we just didn't have anything. I remember putting a blouse on layaway for $1.99 because they couldn't afford to buy it for me. And I babysat for 25 cents an hour to have that money to buy that blouse. I don't even think layaway still exists, but that's what I did. I put a quarter down, and I paid, and I babysat for a quarter an hour. Babysitters now are, I don't know, something astronomical. I remember in kindergarten, now mind you, the farm was outside of a town that today does not have a stoplight. It doesn't have a stoplight. It doesn't have a bank. The feed store is still there. I was just there this summer. My cousin and I taught in Illinois, and I went into Indiana so I could see my cousin. And we took a trip down memory lane. We went to the schools that we went to and the houses that we lived in. But the Bainbridge School, Bainbridge is the name of this little teeny town, which was outside of another small town. And by the way, we had a covered bridge on our road. The covered bridge is fabulous. I used it about 20 years ago on my Christmas card. I took a picture and then photoshopped some of the stuff out, and it's, it's a covered bridge, an old-fashioned covered bridge. But Bainbridge was the town, and that's where I went to kindergarten and first grade. And it's only fair to tell you that in first grade, I can remember clearly being put into the corner on a stool with a dunce hat, literally one of those pointy hats, for talking too much. And no one that knows me would believe that, but yeah, I was talking too much, and I got put in the corner, and I was horrified. And then in second and third grade, or second grade, second grade, we lived in the trailer park, and that's when I was in the spelling bee. And I was in second grade. There were two of each grade, so it was up to 6, so there were 12 classrooms. And I was in the spelling bee, and as a second grader, I came in 5th. Now see, that's impressive, isn't it? I came in 5th, and I misspelled the word politician. And there's no reason it shouldn't be spelled T-I-O-N on the end, which is what I spelled it, because I knew other words that were T-I-O-N. So words, I think, have always sort of been there for me. And then I went to the last school that I went to back there, and Garden City Elementary. And that's where I misspelled my first word in spelling. And I know you're all not going to believe this, but I can remember writing it. It was that lined paper that you had, that weirdo lined paper. And numbers 1 to 12 were on the left, and numbers 13 to 24 were on the right, and number 25 and 26 were in the middle of the page on the fold. And the last word I had to spell was only. And I spelled it O-L-N-Y, and I remember writing it. O-L-N-Y, and I get my paper back, and I've missed it. And it's the first word I had ever missed in spelling. And I get off the bus. My mom described me as being totally hysterical, just a basket case hysterical. I was sobbing so hard that she couldn't get out of me what had happened. She thought something awful. It was awful. I had misspelled a word. But I remember writing that word, number 26, right there on the fold of the paper. And of course, I have perfect, school teacher handwriting. I remember writing that word. First word I ever misspelled. Maybe the last one, I hope. But anyway. Not on the farm. There were no other kids on the farm. There was a little girl down the road. She was younger than I, and I was 5 or 6. So she was, not really old enough to be what you'd call a friend. We didn't spend a lot of time together. But then again, my best friend was my cousin, because that's where I spent all my time. And on the other side of the family, there were cousins also, one sort of my age, a little bit older. And those were my friends. I mean, I don't remember I do remember that when we lived in the house just before we came to California, there was a little girl named Margaret Louise, just like me, and they called her Maggie. So, but I remember that there could be another person in the world with your name. I just remember thinking, how bizarre is that? Anyway. No, we didn't have the money to go anywhere. They did send me to, my grandmother took me to church. We went to a Baptist church, and those were the days when you put on the best clothes you owned, and I wore little white gloves to church. And by the way, you wore little white gloves to go shopping also, and the only place to shop was downtown. So when we would go in to see my grandmother, we would walk to the trolley stop, which was about a half a mile from our house, in my little patent leather shoes and my white gloves. And then we would go downtown to shop, because that's where you shop. And there were 3 department stores, but she took me to church. And so one summer, they sent me to camp. The worst experience of my life. I was terrified. I was maybe 7, and I'm going to camp, and my cousin's going with me. My cousin Roz, my very favorite cousin, who's 3 years older than I, and we were going to camp. And they, everybody built this up, and I was all excited until we got there, and I realized that she wasn't going to be with me. I was going to be all by myself, and she was going to be with the older, she was going to be with her age group. I was going to be with mine. I was only 7. And we went for what seemed like 3 years. I think it was about 2 weeks maybe, or 10 days. I thought it was never going to end. And then there's the thunder and lightning part of this story, which is when we lived on the farm, my grandfather thought it was really funny to take me out into the yard when there was thunder and lightning, and holding me as I was screaming to the top of my lungs. And he thought all that was just really amusing. So now I get to camp, and Rosalind's not with me, and I'm in my bunk, and it was one of those things where there's a platform, and then there's a tent over the platform, and so you're sitting there, you're lying there, and the tent sides are rolled up because it's hot. Oh, geez, it's hot. Some of you might live in the Midwest and you know what I'm talking about. Well, so then the thunder and lightning starts in the middle of the night, and I'm lying next to the outdoors basically, and I'm by myself. I hated every second of it. I couldn't wait to get home. And when we came to California, then our vacations were to go back and see family. And I had terrible allergies back there. And I remember going back, we went back between my freshman and sophomore year of college, and I spent 3 weeks in my aunt's air-conditioned basement because it's the only place I could get my breath. We went in August. I went to the doctor twice, went through 3 boxes of 500 tissues each. It was just miserable. But that's where we went. We never really took vacations. My parents didn't take vacations even later on. They went to Vegas because they loved Vegas. I hate Vegas. Gambling is not my thing. I always say I work too hard for my money to give it to them. Anyway. Yeah, I think there's something to be said for farm life, and that there was a simplicity about it, and it was hard work, but I think my parents, it's all they knew. It's really all they knew, and I really do believe that it grounds you in a place that if you grew up in the city, it doesn't. It's not the same. And I can't say I loved the farm. I can't say I hated the farm. It was my life. It was where I was, and it really is where I first remember reading and really and getting into these books, and just I've been known when I was a kid to prop the book up in the sink, and so that I could do dishes and still read in case I was reading something really good. I figured out a way to prop the book up on the sill and still read while I was doing dishes. It was not popular in my household, you can only imagine, but I was also the type who, I always say I'm the only child on the planet that their parents said, get that book out of there, close that book, put that book away, go to sleep. And so I learned to put the pillow at the bottom of the door so the light wouldn't shine out, so they wouldn't know that I was still reading. I had the flashlight under the covers. I had that, anything to read, anything to read.